And I'd like to introduce Phyllis Saarinen to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to our final lecture in the series Western Hemisphere Archaeology. I do appreciate the enthusiasm I've heard from my friends in the audience here and in Zoom. Have enjoyed this program very much. And I'm going to put in a little plug for my next program, which will be in winter 2025. Yucky or yummy? Can we learn to love bugs? No, seriously, insects have an important role in our ecosystem, and we damage our ecosystem when we spray them. But anyway, I am very pleased to introduce today Chuck Meide, Charles Meide, who will talk about shipwreck archaeology in our nation's oldest port. Chuck is an underwater and maritime archaeologist who since 2006 has been the director of the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Project located at the historic St. Augustine Lighthouse. If you haven't been there, it's very interesting. And maybe the Natural History Society at OCAM can organize a field trip over there sometime. They have a very interesting little museum. It's not something you'd see every day. The LAMP, Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Project, is the research arm of the museum there. Chuck has served in or directed a wide array of shipwreck and maritime archaeological projects in U.S. waters and abroad, including the discovery and total excavation of the French explorer La Salle's 1686 shipwreck La Belle off the coast of Texas. He has also directed the First Coast Maritime Archaeology Project, a state-funded research and educational project focused on offshore and inland waters of Northeast Florida, where he has supervised and participated in numerous projects. Chuck served as a member of the board and also vice president of the Institute of Maritime History from 2009 to 2022. He's been featured in many documentary films, including episodes of public broadcast system television, Secrets of the Dead, and Nova. He earned a BA and MA degrees in anthropology with a focus on underwater archaeology from FSU, and completed coursework toward the PhD in historical archaeology at the College of William and Mary. He's a prolific author. So I'm very pleased to introduce Chuck Meade. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It's so good to be here. Thanks for that great introduction. And I am going to talk to you today about shipwrecks and the archaeology of shipwrecks. So this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. As you will soon see, I'm pretty excited and passionate about my job, so I'm lucky in that respect. And I was able to get a job close to the area of Florida that I grew up in. So as you heard, I'm the director of LAMP, and that's the research arm at the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum. And we have a lot of shipwrecks to keep us busy there because St. Augustine is, of course, the oldest port in the entire country. As we all know, St. Augustine was founded in 1565. That's more than 450 years ago. And ever since, we've had ships coming and going to our little port. Oh. Technical difficulties. A lot of underwater archaeology is dealing with technology and overcoming problems. There we go. So this is my office. This is the St. Augustine Lighthouse. Yeah, it's not a bad view, but and I have been here. It's hard for me to believe it. Next month it'll be 18 years that I've been at the lighthouse, and of course, a lot of people are aware of the lighthouse. If you go to St. Augustine, and we have lots of visitors, millions of visitors to come to St. Augustine because they're interested in going to the beach and they're interested in our history. And my job gets to kind of combine both of those things. But not everyone realizes that the lighthouse is a lot more than just an attraction, that we have a wonderful museum, that we have an underwater archaeology program. We own our own research vessel. We have summer camp programs with kids. We do all kinds of great stuff at the lighthouse. And as you can see, this is our mission: to discover, preserve, present, and keep alive the stories of our nation's oldest port. So we do lots of really interesting and exciting things at the lighthouse. We have about 50 employees. And the lighthouse has been supporting underwater archaeology for quite a while now. So as early as 1997, there were a group of archaeologists that had done a survey off of St. Augustine and found a shipwreck that I will be talking about in a little bit. And Lighthouse put some money towards that. One of the cannons was brought up, and it was conserved on the lighthouse ground so people could see it being treated. And then it wasn't much longer before the director of the lighthouse, the director of the museum, said, you know, our museum should have a research arm, research program, and underwater archaeology is a pretty exciting thing that'll get people interested, and it really ties in well with our mission to preserve maritime history. And so LAMP was founded in 1999. One of the things we do at LAMP, we run a university level field school. So we have college students that come every year. They need to be divers already, but we will train them as scientific divers and take them out in the water, and they work side by side with archaeologists in order to learn how to do archaeology underwater. So you can see we have a good group of students every year, and a lot of these folks, we have 4 archaeologists on staff at the lighthouse. We have a number of volunteers who help us keep the students safe. A lot of times they are students who have been through our field school previous years. And then we may have anywhere from 9 to 10, 11 students. The waters offshore St. Augustine are pretty murky. In fact, usually you can't see your hand in front of your face. It's often, as I sometimes say, archaeology by braille. So we have to train our students how to safely dive in those conditions. And so this is an image taken in the pool, and you can see the diver has duct tape over her mask. And so that's how we train these divers. This guy can't see anything, and he is on an underwater obstacle course. And we have other divers who are hooking bungee cords to his gear, so he gets tangled up, and he has to stop and find where he's tangled and get himself untangled. And after doing that for about an hour in the pool and groping kind of blindly, following a line in a zigzag, you get to a point where you are feeling a lot more comfortable working in the dark, and therefore you're a lot more safe. So we will have to do this kind of training, because when we go offshore, like I said, it can be really difficult to see. So how do we find shipwrecks? It's not, I just told you how dark and murky it is out there, so you can't just swim around and look for them. So we have to use pretty high-tech equipment. We no longer carry whips and revolvers as archaeologists, but instead we have high-tech tools like this magnetometer, and then the cable to the magnetometer. So a magnetometer is basically a metal detector. It's technically what it does is record the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field. And if you have a bunch of iron cannons on the seafloor, you'll create a big spike, a big warp in that magnetic field, and that can clue us in that there's something of interest. And then this is a side scan sonar. You can tow that to one side of the boat or behind the boat, and it puts out sound waves on either side that hit the seafloor, bounce back, and then that creates a bird's eye image of the seafloor. So with these two pieces of equipment together, if we're in a big research vessel like this, we can have our computers all set up. The boat driver basically goes back and forth, and we are scanning as we go. We can also use it off a small boat like this one here, and you can see there's the magnetometer cable. We have to put the mag way out behind the boat because the boat engines will cause interference, or if we're on a steel boat like in the previous picture, you don't want to have any interference. And then we can have sonar. In this case, we have the sonar hanging off the side of the boat here. But we basically, it's like we're mowing the lawn. We're doing a back and forth pattern over a particular search area. And then we have anomalies. We have things that come up that shouldn't normally be there. So sometimes if there's part of the shipwreck sticking up out of the sand, you'll see it with the sonar. If it's buried, which are older shipwrecks in St. Augustine, it seems that they're all buried. We'll get this kind of magnetic contour with a yellow and orange being a spike up in the magnetic field and blue being a spike down. And when we get that kind of up down spike, we know we want to send divers in and take a look. And if we know that whatever is causing that magnetic disturbance is buried, and we'll know that from the sonar, then we have to probe beneath the surface. So this is we will now go from very high-tech equipment that costs tens of thousands of dollars to low-tech equipment that I bought at for $20 at Home Depot, a steel pipe. And then a water pump that might cost $200, but that steel pipe is spewing water out of its tip, and then you can put that in the ground, and it'll sink like a hot knife through butter. Maybe not quite that easily. Sometimes you really have to manhandle it and shove it down. But we can put that thing 10 feet deep and see if we hit anything. And that's how we found a lot of our shipwrecks. So it's not an easy process by any means, but it's the best way to find these things. This is our research vessel, the Empire Defender. And if our divers come up and say, hey, there's something down there worth exploring, then we will come back and do some more extended excavations. Just like archaeologists on land, we want to be very precise. We treat our archaeological site as if it were a crime scene investigation. So we need to know where every little find is and keep track of it, because that's how we do good archaeology. So we grid off our site. On land, they can just use string to make their grid system. That wouldn't last 5 minutes offshore in an ocean environment. So you can see we have a very solid PVC grid. We have lines to secure it. We'll stake it down as well. We need that thing to stay fixed because the divers will also be holding on to that, because a lot of times we have surge and then the divers are like going like this in the water as we're trying to work. And so it's often a very challenging experience. And that grid has to hold up. But otherwise, we do our very best to do as precise archaeology as we possibly can. And you can see this includes using a line level and measuring below that so that we can determine exactly what our elevation is and how many centimeters of sand we excavated on any given dive, as well as making detailed scale drawings of any objects that we expose as we're digging. And so this is how we dig. So this is a dredge hose. That's a 4-inch diameter hose. You can see the diver holding it. And I'll point out that all of the pictures you see of underwater work are taken on the very best days of visibility. So this is considered really good visibility for us off St. Augustine. You can see there's a lot of particulate matter in the water, but that's a really exceptionally good day. It's mostly quite clear. A lot of times you literally can't see anything. And if you can't read a bubble level, then you can't record an elevation. So sometimes we're not able to do that. If you can't read the tape measure on the bottom, sometimes we can swim up. So I've had to swim up 10 feet off the bottom before I could make out the tape measure reading, and then swim back down, but just by feel where I left off, and then get ready to take my next measurement. So it can be a very tedious process, but we're lucky on days like this when we have our grid set up and we've been digging and we are exposing artifacts. So this is an iron cauldron, like a cooking pot. Now the other end of our dredge is spewing out all the sand that the divers suck up. So this dredge hose way over here somewhere, the diver's holding the sucking end of that, and this is the end spitting out. This blue hose is a fire hose, so that's pumping water from our pump on the boat, and basically it creates a Venturi effect. So it's pushing water out this way, and that's creating a suction in this hose, and so all the water is going this way. And at the other end where the diver is, that diver is using that hose to suck up sand, and you can see the sand cloud here. This is a set of mesh bags. We use at least 2 mesh bags attached to that dredge head so that anything we suck up is filtered through that. So especially if the divers can't see very well, we don't want to miss any small artifacts. So everything gets filtered through this mesh bag in the same way that archaeologists on land will deposit the dirt they're digging into a screen, and they have someone sort through it on the screen. We let the water do most of the sorting, and at the end of the dive, we bring up a bag of dredge spoil, and that looks like a muddy, shelly mess like you see here. And we have volunteers like Ed Coward here. Ed showed up and wanted to volunteer with us. We take a lot of volunteers, as you can imagine, a program like ours. And so Ed was sorting through dredge spoil from the storm wreck, and lo and behold, he found a gold coin. Now, Ed's daughter is an archaeologist, and she was visiting him, and she said, "Archaeologists never find gold." And Ed was like, "Well, good thing I'm not an archaeologist then." And Ed has come back and volunteered every Wednesday ever since. He shows up like clockwork. So he's a really loyal volunteer, but he made a really exciting find. So this is a view of St. Augustine from 1783. And one of our shipwrecks went down just the year before that, the shipwreck that gold coin came from. So this is a good idea of what it would look like if you were trying to get into St. Augustine. So in this picture, north is to the right, and it's showing you the approach from the sea, because that, of course, was the way that most people would get in to St. Augustine. And you can see we have these sandbars here that almost guard the entrance. That's what makes the inlet so dangerous for ships coming in. You basically have to thread the needle to get in between those sandbars. And of course, sand moves around. It's not like a coral reef down in South Florida or a rocky coastline up in New England where the hazards to navigation stay in one place. Our hazards to navigation move around. If there's been a big storm, a nor'easter, a hurricane, the sandbars are going to move. And what used to be a safe channel, maybe even just a week before, all of a sudden can be a very dangerous place to be. And of course, here's the fort up here. If you know St. Augustine, you know the Castillo is here. These are the streets laid out that were laid out as early as the 1570s for downtown St. Augustine. The lighthouse, this is the location of the watchtower that eventually would be rebuilt into the lighthouse as we know it today here on Anastasia Island. And most of our shipwrecks are right where that X is. And that makes sense because that's the bottleneck, right? That's the area that is most dangerous when you go from the open ocean and try to get in here. And we have one that's up here. I think someone thought he could get through this channel, and really that's just for fishermen and small boats. So it can be quite a dangerous place. This is Dr. Johann Schoep. Schepp, my German friends tell me. It's pronounced Johann Schepp. And Dr. Schepp was a surgeon in the British Army. He visited St. Augustine after the American Revolution. He was one of those Hessians that the American rebels were fighting against. And he tells us in his memoirs just how dangerous it is to get into St. Augustine. And in fact, he paints a very lurid tale of a very descriptive story of what it was like to get into St. Augustine. He sailed from Charleston, South Carolina, which was a very common trading partner with St. Augustine during the British period. And so he tells us, well, I've got some great quotes from him. The sandbar before St. Augustine is unquestionably the most dangerous of all the colonies. It is indeed a fearful thing to hear the wild tumult of these breaking seas and to behold them on all sides foaming and tossing. It has become so common at St. Augustine to see ships aground on this bar disasters of the sort have almost ceased to arouse either sympathy or wonder. Without the least overstatement, I dare say that every 100 paces on the beach, the skeleton of a foundered ship or its wreckage may be seen. Who could pass this way without emotion? If one imagines to himself the terror so many souls must have suffered here, and the lives that have been here lost. The estimate is that every fortnight to a month at the most, a vessel is wrecked on this coast. Now, they say the graveyard of the Atlantic is up in North Carolina, but I think we're a solid contender for it because we have a few extra centuries on them. Should the sea withdraw after centuries, it would be an astounding thing to come upon the relics of these ships. So I love Shep. I mean, he's just such a good writer. And he told about the captain of the ship, young captain who was sweating bullets. It's relatively safe when you're in the open ocean. It's once you get within sight of your destination that the danger begins. And of course, there was an old salt who was telling tales of many a ship have come to their doom in St. Augustine. And so it was really quite the story that he told, as you can see here. Now, at LAMP, we can't part the seas like Moses can, but we can do the next best thing, which is to dive beneath those waters and make archaeological discoveries. And so that's what we do. So I mentioned before, the X on the map is right about this area. This is a modern aerial chart, and you can see we have a number of shipwrecks here, and then one wreck up here that may have been trying to get into a different inlet, one of the smaller inlets. But they're definitely clustered around. Some of these date to the 1800s, like these three. Some of these date to the 1700s, like these two and this one up here, and then some we're not quite sure yet. We haven't fully explored them yet. But I'm going to give you a kind of a whirlwind tour of some of these shipwrecks, so you'll get a feel for what it's like to be a shipwreck archaeologist in St. Augustine. So the steamship ballast pile shipwreck site. This was one of the, not that any of them are easy to find, but this was one of the easier ones to find because it sticks up off the bottom like a sore thumb. You can see from this artist rendition, we had a great volunteer who drew this for us. This engine here is probably 10 feet tall off the bottom, at least 10 feet tall. There's a big boiler as well. And then a pile of rocks, a ballast pile off to one side. Now, ballast is often used in sailing ships so that you have weight deep down in the hull because your masts make you very top heavy. And so you want to keep your center of gravity low, so you need some weight in the hold, especially if you don't have a heavy cargo. You want to make sure you have some heavy ballast. So we have two possibilities here. It could be that this is one shipwreck and you had some ballast on to help trim that vessel to get it so that it was just sitting properly in the water. But usually with the steamship, you don't need much ballast because you have a lot of weight in the engine and the boiler and the coal that's needed to propel the ship. So it's possible this is two ships that maybe collided with each other and wrecked, or one of them may have wrecked and the other might have collided with that, or they could have by sheer chance wrecked right next to each other. And we're not 100% sure, but it's a pretty neat shipwreck. I talked about using sonar to see a bird's eye view of what the shipwreck looks like. This is an example of a sonar image of our ship. And you can see we have a boiler, we have an engine, and we have a propeller that's sticking up out of the mud. Two of the blades you can see here, and that matches our drawings here. And then we have our ballast pile, and at one point in 2009, we dug a trench across the ballast pile and revealed the hull timbers beneath. When archaeologists first found this shipwreck, before I was at LAMP, in fact, before LAMP was founded even, they spent a lot of time with the machinery, and the equipment, the steam equipment is very well preserved. So it's quite interesting. In fact, we're working on nominating this site to the National Register right now, and the well-preserved steam equipment is quite significant. So you can see it was very well recorded, so we understand how it was built and how it operated. These are the drawings we made of the shipwrecked hull beneath the ballast pile. So we dug this 8-meter long trench and exposed a little bit extra outside the trench to try to understand how the wooden hull was constructed. And I'm going to move on to the next shipwreck. This is the centerboard schooner. So this one was a sailing vessel. It did not have a steam engine. A centerboard is important if you are a shallow drafted vessel, but you also need to sail in deep waters. So the centerboard schooner would lift up its centerboard when it was going to get over that sandbar and come into the harbor at St. Augustine. But when it left again, as soon as it got outside into deep water, it would lower its centerboard, and then it would have the capabilities of a good deep water sailor. And the centerboard is right in the middle here. Basically, what we have is a buried wooden hull, and we have 2 big piles of cargo. So these are barrels of cement. And so you had barrels of dry cement, and when the ship wrecked and sank, the water eventually leaked into the barrels, and now most of that wood is gone, and we have basically barrel-shaped lumps of cement. And it's quite an interesting dive. I mean, this is 20 feet across or something. So this is quite a big ship, more than 100, maybe 130, 140 feet long. So this, out of 20 years of diving on this shipwreck, we had 1 or 2 days that were good enough to take a few pictures, and it's still pretty poor visibility, as you can see. But you can actually see one of the barrels here, and you can kind of barely see it here. So this is much more typical of our good visibility, believe it or not. And so the sonar is quite helpful because we can sonar the site and we can get an image of what it looks like. This was taken before and after Tropical Storm Faye. And then much more recently, just in 2022, we took images before and after Hurricane Ian. And you can tell the site is quite different. So there was a lot more sand on the site before the hurricane. So you're basically seeing just the tip of the iceberg here on this pile of cargo, and just a little bit of cargo here. And then after that storm, look how much bigger, these are to the same scale. Look how much bigger that pile is and how close they are together, and how much more we have in this second pile of cargo. So the sonar helps us. We sent divers down, and we could feel, and it was just black. You couldn't see anything. We could feel exposed wood where before we didn't have any wood exposed, but the sonar really shows a good picture for us. This is the Industry. The Industry wrecked in 1764, making it the oldest shipwreck we have yet discovered off of St. Augustine. And the Industry, as you can see, was a sailing vessel. It was a sloop, and it was a supply vessel. It was basically a store ship. And so Florida was Spanish for its first 200 years. And then in 1763, it was ceded from Spain to Britain. That's because of the 7 Years' War, the French-Indian War. And so Britain took control of her new colony and ordered supplies, and she had soldiers garrisoned in St. Augustine, but they needed weapons, they needed tools, they needed ammunition. And so the Industry was one of 2 ships that was sent there. One of them wrecked on the way, I think off North Carolina or something. And the Industry got almost all the way and then wrecked right outside the inlet. So a lot of the cargo, the ship broke up and a lot of stuff floated ashore. And then the governor was complaining. Actually, it was before the governor was even in place. It was General Gage, who was the acting governor, British officer. And so he was complaining that all the locals were going out and pulling tools and other pieces of flotsam off the beach, when of course that was the king's property. So that was he was upset about that, but there's only so much that could be done about it. And so what we have is this little pocket of cargo on the ship has remained intact, even though most of the shipwreck is gone around it. It's kind of an interesting little phenomenon, but we have these cannons that are stacked end to end right here. So we know that they were stowed below decks for safe storage. So those cannons were not in gun carriages. They were not on the deck ready to use, but they were a cargo item. We have mooring anchors, same thing. They're stacked end to end. Do you know how I can tell that's a mooring anchor rather than a normal ship's anchor? And by the way, a mooring anchor is for setting up a permanent mooring. So today in St. Augustine, the city has set up mooring so that if you look out across the bay, you see these buoys, and sailboats come up and tie off to the buoy, and then they pay the city to stay there on that mooring. Well, these are mooring anchors, and the reason we know is that they have one arm only. See, there's only one fluke here and no fluke on the other side. In Florida, it's not as important, but in Britain and Ireland, you have such a big tide change that if you have a standard anchor, you might have a fluke sticking straight up, and you might lose enough water with the tide change that your boat might end up sinking on its own anchor. It might lower itself onto the anchor and put a hole in it, and then you're going to sink. So they learn quickly, for mooring anchors, you only want one arm. And we know that they wanted to set up, they wanted to set up a proper British colony and make some good money. And they didn't, the British didn't think that the Spanish knew how to make a proper colony at all. So they were bringing in things they thought were essential to make a good, prosperous colony. And they, of course, brought in a lot of enslaved labor at the same time. And the idea was they were going to have indigo plantations and sugar plantations and things like that. So the industry was part of that infrastructure. Weaponry to defend the colony, like this cannon here, a box of axes, tea kettle, you got to have tea if you're a British subject, of course, cooking pots, millstones, tools. These, you can see those are saw handles, just like you might have in your garage. So the same kind of stuff that we still use today in some cases. And things that they certainly needed to start their colony off on the right foot. The cannon was one of the things that helped us identify the shipwreck. It has King George II's crest. That puts us in the right time period. Has a British broad arrow. That means it's British government property, Royal Navy property. And then these numbers are the weight of the gun in 100 weights, quarter weights, and pounds. And then a small one-person cannon as well, a little swivel gun. This was probably one of the most unique things found on the industry. There was a box that was still sealed up, and it literally told the archaeologists what was inside. Number 5, Illinois axes, 20. And when they opened it up, sure enough, there were 20 axe heads in there. You didn't need to worry about the handles, because if you're in a colony, you got plenty of trees growing, so you can make your own handles. What you need are the axe heads, because there's no ironworks locally. Now, this writing is really unique, and the conservators in the lab were able to preserve it. It's faded a little bit, but you can still read it. So this is the day it was first brought out of the water. This is after it was treated so that that lid, that box, could be dried out and put on display. And unfortunately, this site was targeted by treasure hunters. And so we had an incident in 1999 where, in the middle of the night, some professional treasure hunters came out in their boat. They used big metal devices, big metal hoods that bolt down in place around their propeller. And so then they rev the boat's engine, and it forces the propeller wash straight down. And you can see that dump, moves a lot of sand. So instead of digging with dredges very carefully, these guys blew a hole probably 10 feet deep and 20 feet across in just a matter of minutes. And so we don't know what we may have lost in that episode, but we do know they stole 2 cannons. So there were 2 less cannons on the site after that raid, and the perpetrators were never apprehended. So that is a real danger that we face as archaeologists. Now, not all of our shipwrecks are underwater. This is an example of one of those skeletons of foundered ships that you could find on the beach. This one, the spring break wreck, we call it the spring break wreck because it showed up during spring break, and just like a bunch of college kids descending on your town, it caused a whole bunch of hullabaloo in a very short amount of time. And we had thousands of people that came to see this shipwreck. This popped up, I think, in March of 2017, and it just came from offshore. It was not buried on the beach. Sometimes we have wreckage that's already on the beach. It's buried, and a storm will uncover it. But in this case, it came ashore. And because of that, it was very well preserved. You could see tool marks in the wood. I mean, it was like it was brand new, which was really interesting. And it's about a 50-foot long piece of wreckage. And as I mentioned, lots of people. The local sheriff told us that they estimated about 1,000 people a day were coming to see this shipwreck. So there were a lot of traffic issues, a lot of people cutting through other people's yards to get to the beach. We did some public archaeology as we were also trying to do archaeology. So we had one guy who was always talking to the public and answering questions while the rest of us were recording and taking pictures and making drawings and taking measurements, that kind of thing. But this is a section of a ship from probably the late 1800s. It must have wrecked offshore and been buried somewhere offshore because the wood was in such good shape. It's a portion of the side of the ship. So this is a side view of the wreckage scaled to fit this kind of typical 19th century ship there. So we basically have the section right at the waterline, as you can see. I mentioned markings on the hull. Look at this. We have 2 X's and 4 I's. That's a Roman numeral 24. So the ribs or the frames were pre-numbered by the shipwrights, and we could still see those numbers, which is amazing. You do not normally have that kind of preservation, and certainly after a few days and then a few weeks of sitting on the beach, you could no longer see those numbers. We had tool marks. You can see a big mallet has made impressions. Someone was really whacking the bejesus out of this plank to get it to fit in place. We have saw marks. You can see these vertical marks. That's from a bandsaw. So that's mid to late 1800s, more common in the late 1800s, steam technology. And circular saw marks as well, a steam-powered saw. You can see those quite clearly here. So we began to find all these clues that helped us narrow down the date range. We took a lot of wood samples, and we found we had a mix of both hardwood and softwoods in the framing of the vessel. And actually, we later realized there was a switch at the waterline. So above and below the waterline, they used southern yellow pine and then American beech below the waterline. And so looking at some of the different species of wood we have, we estimate, well, it's probably all of these overlap in the Carolinas area. So our guess right now is made somewhere in the mid-Atlantic in that region. The hull, despite its size, was tossed around like a play toy by the surf. So we lost a lot of timbers overnight the first night, and then we tied it down, we strapped it down, and we eventually, there wasn't really any good solution to preserve this. So the state agreed that we could move it. We had someone volunteer, a company volunteered to move it off the beach, and it was placed at the NER, the National Estuarine Research Reserve, where it is slowly deteriorating. There's really nothing we can do unless someone has a few $1 million they want to give us, but at this point it's a little late. But at least people can see it still, and we have been able to study it there and learn some more about it. Which if it was left on the beach, it would have been knocked to pieces, and people were coming up and trying to cut pieces off it, and so we would have lost it completely. Yeah, it's amazing what people will do. Now this is another example of a beach wreck. This one was buried. And after we had hurricanes Matthew and Irma, and then the following year we had a lot of nor'easters. And so in 2020, right during COVID year, when we weren't doing any more diving temporarily, some timbers became exposed, and we got interested. And this is in Crescent Beach, which is a little bit to the south of St. Augustine. And so we dug a few test areas to confirm that, yes, 100%, this is a shipwreck. This isn't a piece of a dock or something like that. And then we let it get reburied. And when the county told us they were going to be doing beach replenishment and dumping millions of gallons of sand on the beach, we figured, well, we might as well dig the entire thing up, record it completely, and then rebury it, and then let them put another 10 feet of sand on top of it. And so it started off kind of looking like we were in ancient Egypt doing a dig by the pyramids. Because the sand had been, you can see a lot of sand has accumulated. About 3 or 4 feet of sand were on top of this hole that had been exposed just the year before. So this is 2021. And so we started with a trench and expanded that into a pit, exposed more of the timbers and then more of the timbers until we had the entire piece completely exposed. And you can imagine we used a lot of volunteers. We did not have earth-moving machinery. We just had a whole bunch of volunteers with shovels, and they would fill tarps with sand, and then people would drag the tarps and dump it to make kind of a berm on this side. We had a wall of sand out here to help keep the tide from filling our hole. So it was quite a project. And essentially what we have is the bow of a ship. So if you imagine the forward end of a ship, up at the bow, if that ship fell to one side and lost the starboard side, you're looking at the inside of the port bow here. So this curve here is the very front of the ship. The keel would have been down here, and then the stem would be up here. And all these planking here would have fit into the stem. So here's the drawing that we did. And of course, we record everything as meticulously as possible. And you can see some of these planks have a kind of a slant to them here. That's because they were cut to fit into the stem. So that's the bow of the ship. We had tested a lot of these timbers as well to see what species they were. And we saw there was quite a lot of tamarack or larch. In fact, below the water line is right here on this vessel. Below the water line, it looks like they used larch only or tamarack only. That's a timber that grows in the northeast. Oh, I don't have a map of it, but basically that comes from the very northeast United States or Canada in that area. And so that suggests our ship was built maybe somewhere in Maine, somewhere up that far north. And it's believed we have the Caroline Eddy. And this is the Caroline Eddy. She wrecked in 1880, and she was built in Maine as a supply vessel for the U.S. Army during the Civil War. And then she became a trading vessel. And she wrecked during a hurricane right in that same area, close to the Matanzas Inlet. And so she would have broken to pieces, and pieces could have come ashore, and we were right offshore. So we think that we have the Caroline Eddy. This is a picture of her that was painted in Sicily. So she sailed all over the Atlantic, including to the Mediterranean and back. The anniversary wreck. This is one of my favorites. So the picture you saw earlier of the divers and the cauldron, that was the anniversary wreck. We call it the anniversary wreck because we discovered it on the 450th anniversary of St. Augustine in 2015. And so one of our divers said, well, Chuck, we need to find a birthday present to give to St. Augustine. And so this was our birthday present, our anniversary present. And you can see the date range here, 1765. We dug on this site from 2016 until COVID, so 2016 to 2019, and we're planning on getting back out there and doing some more digging. But you can see we have some barrels. I don't think they're cement, but they're something, probably iron that has concreted over so they look like those cement barrels. But they're probably full of iron. We have shoe buckles, a lot of broken pottery. All these things can help date the site. We had some really good visibility, so we took a whole bunch of pictures of the site, and the computer can now piece those pictures together into a three-dimensional model. So this is a composite map made up of hundreds of different photographs that the computers put together. But you can see there's a lot of barrels and cauldrons. Some cauldrons are stacked three in a row. In fact, that's the cauldron that was in the picture that you saw earlier, the first artifact we uncovered. So there's our drawing. So basically we have a ship that ran aground and then got broken up, and we have scattered cargo, but it's very densely scattered here. So we're probably close to where the main cargo hold originally was when the ship fell to pieces. And we have a lot of cauldrons in an area that's geez, not even half the size of this wooden stage that I'm standing on. So in just half of this, I think we counted 24 cauldrons. So that's a lot. So this is a cargo ship. This is bringing in a lot of stuff to St. Augustine, and no single ship needs 24 cauldrons on its own to feed its crew. So these were intended to be sold at market to St. Augustine. And you can see a lot of them. This one, there were 4 stacked together. This is a really big one. This one, you've got 3 stacked together. This one, I think, is 4 stacked together. So they were cramming as many in as they could. Broken pottery helps us date the wreck. Shoe buckles as well. This is all pointing to the second half of the 1700s. We had some pewter plates and some stone. St. Augustine, we have coquina, but otherwise we don't have very much stone at all. So they would have been bringing in stone for windowsills and things like that for building in St. Augustine. There's one of those pewter plates. We actually found a maker's mark on one of the pewter plates. So the pewter smith left his mark, but man, it was so faint we couldn't read it. So we couldn't tell for sure where it comes from. That would have been really handy, but it's not that easy. This is a piece of creamware. You can see this one is a type that was common in British sites, especially between 1765 and the end of the century there. So this is the British period, or possibly into the second Spanish period. We can get down to brass tacks. We had a lot of them. Pins were used very frequently for clothing, to pin your clothing. And then tacks could have been from furniture or a chest. This is a little piece of leather with a tack still in it. This is an X-ray of a concretion that has tacks in it. I think I've got some pictures of concretions coming up. We found a number of brass doorknobs. So again, just supplies that would have been used to be sold in the market. This is an X-ray image. A lot of the things we find on the seafloor are big, lumpy, bumpy. They're just covered with mineral deposits. We can't tell what they are. I think I've got, yeah, so there's an example here. Like this rusty red stuff here, we don't know what's inside there until we X-ray it. Now, in this case, this brass piece doesn't rust over the same way, and so it's sticking out. So we could clearly see that it was a key plate. And then these white balls you see here, those are lead shot, tiny lead pellets. We have a lot of ammunition on this wreck as well. So this is a typical thing that we would find, what we call a concretion, because it kind of looks like a piece of concrete. And then when we X-ray that, in this case, we can see there's a lot of iron nails. There's another key plate and an actual key. And then you can see these brass tacks and lead shot. So any stuff, when the ship breaks up, you have artifacts probably moving around underwater with that surge. And if they end up in kind of a pocket or get buried and there's iron, the iron will rust over and bloom over and form a big blob, and they all get stuck into that. We had some interesting organic remains. So we had an olive pit and we had a peach pit. In fact, we had 13 peach pits, all from 1 meter square unit. Because I'm always paranoid, like, oh, I hope no one was throwing their lunch overboard. But we have very strict rules on the boat. You don't throw anything, you don't throw any trash overboard, even if it's something organic, because we don't want to mix a modern apple seed with something we might find on the shipwreck. And we were very careful on this site, so we know nobody threw any olive pits over or peaches over. And the fact that we had 13 peaches from one small area suggests there was a sack of peaches or a cask of peaches or something like that on board. And if this was a merchant ship from Charleston or Savannah, you would certainly expect peaches to be coming on board to be traded in St. Augustine for perhaps oranges that could then go back up to those cities. We take sediment samples as we dig, and then we sort through increasingly fine meshed screens, and we find all kinds of things that used to be on the ship. So you can see here we have bits of beetles and the head of an ant, the mandible from a beetle or possibly an ant. Crazy stuff. I hope you've all had time for your lunch to settle, because we're looking at bug parts right now. Beetle heads, beetle wing covers. This is a kind of beetle known as the drugstore beetle or the biscuit beetle. Well, biscuit almost certainly refers to ship's biscuit, which is basically bread, which would have been baked twice. So it was a really hard bread. The sailors would break their teeth on it if they weren't careful to soak it in water or soup first. But this is the kind of thing that infested ships, so it's not surprising. And they're not very good flyers, so it's not like they flew out a mile offshore to end up on the shipwreck. It's almost certain that these guys were on the ship when it sank. Hide beetles as well. Obviously, they infest hides and other things, so food supplies or leather, trade goods. And then we had a little bit of a mouse or a rat as well, so that's not too surprising. And the last shipwreck I'm going to talk about, which is one of our favorites, is the storm wreck. We don't know the name of the storm wreck. That's why it has that nickname. But we know a lot about it because we worked on this site from, as you can see, from 2010 to 2015. So we dived on it every year between 2010 and 15. I went to London and did research in the British National Archives, what used to be the Public Records Office. We found a lot of documentation. So we know what fleet this ship was in. We know a lot of its story, but we don't quite know the name of the actual ship. But you never know. We might figure it out. And you can see that's me there. That's a pretty exciting day, the day we brought up 2 cannons from this shipwreck. So again, like Anniversary Wreck, this one consists of a scatter of material, mostly concreted objects. There are very few pieces of the hull itself. So this is a shipwreck timber here. And I think this piece there's a little shipwreck timber right here as well. But for the most part, there's not much of the ship left. So we think it ran aground, broke to pieces. Actually, before it broke to pieces, we're pretty sure that they were trying to save the ship by lightening it. So we think they threw a lot of things overboard. So these cannons that you see here, kind of in a pile, they probably threw those overboard to try to get the ship to float up off the sandbar, but we don't think they were successful. And the ship ended up eventually being broken to pieces, and the cargo remains, or in this case, a lot of personal possessions, were kind of scattered out in an area that you can see here. And we did metal detecting all out around here, and we found stuff pretty far out, even 100 feet away. We were finding isolated objects, but certainly this is the most densely scattered area of the ship, and the cannons aren't going to move very far from where they were dumped. Though that being said, we found one cannon 30 feet out, so we don't know how that one got out there, and that one still had part of its gun carriage on it. But so this is what the shipwreck looks like, if you could see it all at once, at least. We spent a lot of time. You can see a total of 136 days diving, more than 1,300 dives. We didn't have any significant safety incident with all those dives, so we're very proud of that record. Over 1,000 hours of underwater time. Certainly one of the things about underwater archaeology compared to land archaeology is that every moment is precious. You only have so much time on the bottom. The fact that we're recording how many minutes we had on the bottom should let you know that we treasure and value that time. There's only so much time we can get, so we clock it carefully. And you can see we had a total of 92 divers, including 55 students working with us. We ran 6 field schools during that time, and there's probably more articles that have been published since then. But this shipwreck has gained a lot of attention outside of St. Augustine, and a lot of our colleagues were very interested to see especially the artifacts that we found. We found a lot of stuff on this wreck. When National Geographic came and they wanted to do our ship on Drain the Oceans, we were pretty excited about that. And so these are some of the graphics that they came up with. So this is a pretty good view of what the shipwreck looked like for us, except when we first found it, everything was buried by sand. But then the following winter we came, and actually some of the cannons were exposed. We had 5 cannons and the ship's bell exposed. And you can see the cannons here. I don't know if you can see the bell in this picture or not. But so I have a few. There's the bell right here. So this would give you an idea of what we could have seen, except of course we never saw this because Everything was so dark. And I will say the first day, after our first summer season, we came back that winter and we did a dive in December 17th. And actually the divers went down and they came up and they said, "Oh my God, we can see 10 feet down there." And we had never seen the wreck before at all. So we had only worked by feel for a whole summer, and all of a sudden they can see 10 feet. So it would have looked like this, a little hazier than this. And then the next thing the diver said was, "And there's 5 cannons and a ship's bell." And I was like, "You got to be kidding." And the diver looked up at me and he's like, "Yeah, I'm kidding." And I looked at his face and he had a smile on his face like the Cheshire cat. And I'm like, "You're not kidding." And he's like, "No, I'm not kidding." So we went, actually the first thing we did, we got the divers out of the water and we raced home to grab a camera because we had never taken an underwater picture on our shipwreck before. We never bothered bringing an underwater camera with us. So we came back with a camera. We got pictures of the ship's bell and some of the cannons. We brought up the bell that same day. And then we thought like, oh, maybe the visibility is good in the winter. We came back the next day to do some more work and it was pitch black. You couldn't see a thing. So this was rare. Seeing it like this was a real treasure. But that gives you an idea of what the ship would look like if we could see it. So we found a lot of stuff on this shipwreck. And you can see very quickly, there's an X-ray from a concretion of a pistol. Here's a shoe buckle, a tea kettle. This is the oldest barbecue grill in the state of Florida. I mean, it probably is. This is a pewter spoon, belt buckle, the base of a wine glass, cannonball, broken pottery, bricks, wooden handles to a knife, buttons, another pewter spoon, a big cauldron. This was the first artifact we found on this shipwreck. But both of those shipwrecks, the first artifact we found was a cauldron, believe it or not. And then pewter plates we had on Storm Wreck as well. So we had a lot of artifacts. We're beginning to narrow down the date range. We think we have something in the second half of the 1700s, maybe the late 1700s. And when we found those cannons, we're like, well, we need to pull those cannons up because maybe you'll have a date on one of the cannons. So this is a carronade, a short, stubby little cannon. Carronades were really high tech for the time. They were invented during the American Revolution in Scotland by the British at the Carron Iron Works in Falkirk, Scotland. And so this cannon was a 9-pounder. That means even though it's half the size as the other cannon you saw, it has twice the firepower. The other cannon was only a 4-pounder, which means it fires a 4-pound cannonball. This one fires a 9-pound cannonball. So it's designed to be small and lightweight, so you don't need many men to handle it, and so it doesn't overweigh your ship, so you can have a more powerful armament on your vessel without being too top heavy. The drawback is because it's so short, it doesn't have the range. So you're sacrificing range for more power. So that means if the other ship out there taking shots at you is more nimble and quick than you and can keep its distance, then they could pound you to bits before you could even hit them. So that's why we had a mixed battery. We had some long guns and the carronade. And indeed, when we cleaned off that carronade on the trunnion on the side, we had 1780, 1780. That's a pretty good date. It doesn't get more clear than that. So that was the first dated object we found. It also says 9P, that's 9-pounder. Because this was a high-tech weapon, the Scots really wanted to get a fat military contract with the British Royal Navy, so they put all the bells and whistles on their guns. So that included some inscriptions. The other cannon you saw, that was just like a Walmart special. That didn't have any writing on it at all. On the other side of the cannon, on the other trunnion, we actually had a serial number, believe it or not. You can barely see a 4, 7, and 8 here. And we didn't realize, but there was also some numbers up here, I think a 3 and a 4. And we had someone, a student who was at Southampton University in England. She went to Scotland to their national archives, and she found carronade number 34478, one of 17 carronades that were 9-pounders 6 diameter. So the diameter of the bore times 6 is how long it is. Whoops. 6 diameters with snugs. We don't really know what snugs are, but we think they're the little handles on the back. So if I go back a few, you'll see these handles there. That's our best guess as to what snugs are. But she was sold on consignment to a merchant named Richard Sinclair in London. So if we could find Richard Sinclair's merchant books, his account books, we would maybe know the name of the ship that he sold it to. And so we might be able to identify our ship, but it's pretty hard to find a merchant's account books. Those things usually get thrown away after the merchant passes on. So at this point, we've got a date, 1780. So we know our shipwreck has to have occurred, couldn't have occurred before 1780, right? So we can eliminate some of these early ones. And we're really looking at this here, 16 unidentified loyalist vessels, 1782. And actually the Rattlesnake was with those loyalist vessels. So we had 16, maybe 17 ships wreck that were carrying refugees who were loyal to King George from Charleston to St. Augustine. And we had a pretty good feeling we had one of those ships. It's kind of a gut feeling. Archaeologists, sometimes we trust our guts. The artifacts we were finding seemed consistent with what refugees would carry. We had a lot of personal possessions. We had a lot of cookware. You got to feed your family. So we had tableware and cookware and all that kind of thing. But we were really wondering, how the heck can you tell 240 years later where somebody's loyalty lied? Essentially, how do you know someone's politics? Now, you know, the loyalists are an important part of our history. You know, at least a third, if not more, of Americans were loyal to King George and were not picking up arms and fighting against king and country. And at the end of the war, they got the short end of the stick. During the war, there were a lot of atrocities on both sides. So we hear about loyalists being tarred and feathered. Well, if you have molten tar poured down your back, you're going to die unless you get a skin graft. And skin grafts have not been invented yet. So that's a death sentence. So it was pretty bad. So from the very start of the war, you had a lot of loyalists who were fleeing. A lot would go up north to Canada, and then a lot were coming to Florida, which was a loyal British colony at the time. But how can you tell from someone's stuff? I mean, both of these groups of people are Americans, right? They're going to use the same kind of plates. They're going to use the same kind of spoons. They're going to use the same kind of weapons. How do you tell where someone's politics lie? Now, it's easy enough during an election year. You can look in your neighbor's yard and you know who he's going to vote for if they're putting up yard signs like that. So we're trying to find the equivalent of a yard sign 240 years later so that we can tell with any kind of certainty, do we have loyalists on board this ship, or could this just as easily be an American ship that wrecked a few years after the war, and you'd otherwise never know the difference. So we didn't know what kind of artifact that might entail until we found it. And it came in the smallest of packages. This is a button. It has a little crown on it. Crown certainly indicates loyalty to the king. It has the letters RP. That stands for Royal Provincials. This was a military button for a unit in the British Army that was made up entirely of Americans who were loyal to King George. So this told us that we had an artifact associated with loyalists on board our shipwreck. So we felt this was pretty strong circumstantial evidence. Maybe not quite a smoking gun, but we were pretty excited. Then we found this button. This has a 71 and a distinctive kind of zigzaggy line around the edge. Well, if you look to British military uniform books, this is a button from the 71st Regiment of the British Army. This is a Scottish regiment. So there were a lot of Royal Provincial units. We don't know which one that is. There's only one 71st. We know its exact history. We know that they fought in the thick of a lot of battles. They were at the Battle of Cowpens in South Carolina. They were at the Battle of Yorktown, which of course is Washington's famous victory. The ones who were not killed at Yorktown and who did not surrender fought a fierce rearguard action as the retreating army made it back to Charleston. And the 71st were aboard the last fleet to evacuate Charleston that set sail December 18th, 1782, the same fleet that lost 16 ships in St. Augustine. This is pretty solid evidence. And then to bolster that, we found more Royal Provincial buttons in better shape. Here's our Highlander. But then we also found a button from the 3rd American Regiment. That's another RP unit. The 3rd American Regiment, the 63rd Regiment, and the 30th Regiment. The only thing throughout all history, the only time all of those regiments were in the same place is when they were in Charleston, December 18th, 1782, and they all boarded that fleet that lost 16 ships in St. Augustine. So we consider this very compelling evidence that we have one of those evacuation ships. And so then we did a lot. I got to go to London and spent a week in a little bed and breakfast that was just a short walk from what used to be the Public Records Office, the National Archives. I looked for anything I could find on the evacuation of Charleston. And there were 2 evacuations. We're talking about the final evacuation. And it was quite an event. I mean, this was really a world war. We think of the First World War as taking place in the 20th century, but they definitely had them in the 18th century because British fought in theaters, in the Indian Ocean, in Africa, in Europe, and in North and South America and the Caribbean. They were fighting the French and the Americans and the Spanish all over. And this is quite an operation before modern communication systems. But they had to organize 11,000 people, more than 11,000 people leaving. So I found a lot of letters that were written as far away as Jamaica and Quebec talking about, well, we need all the ships that you can get sent to Charleston by this date. And you can see they had quite a fleet. So there was a group of ships that went to England. There were 9 ships that went to Halifax. They had departed a little earlier. 48 ships going to New York. 8 ships were coming to East Florida. Some were stored in St. Augustine to be used in the next evacuation, they said. 29 ships going to Jamaica and 5 ships going to St. Lucia, also in the Caribbean. And so this is one of the documents that I found. A list of transports appointed to receive the garrison of Charlestown. It includes the 63rd Regiment and the 71st. When I first saw this, I thought, oh my God, our ship is the Sally with Captain Bell. Now, our ship is not the Sally because I also found a newspaper article in Kingston, Jamaica that said the Sally arrived safe with the 71st on board. So sometimes you don't get all the answers in archaeology, but you get some awfully tantalizing clues. And I'll go back to here and say this document had a lot of pages. It listed all the ships that went to Canada. It listed all the ships that went to Jamaica. It listed all the ships that went to Halifax. It listed all the ships that went to St. Lucia. There was one page missing, which would have been the list of ships going to Florida. That one was not there. So that one is currently lost to history, and with any luck, someone will find it. But right now, we don't have a list of names. If we did, we could probably figure out which ship we had. This was another reference to the lost fleet in St. Augustine. This was written by Elizabeth Lichtenstein Johnston. She was a loyalist from Georgia. She published this letter in her memoirs in the 1830s. And she says, out of the last fleet from Charleston, there have been 16 sail of small vessels lost on and about the bar. There are 6 or 8 high on the beach. 'Tis amazing how such a place was settled. She was not impressed with St. Augustine at all. She thought the weather was it was cold and stormy weather in February, in January and February, but not like this has been a pretty nice winter, I think. This is a letter from the governor to the commander-in-chief of British forces, and he says 1,000 loyalists and about 1,500 Negroes, obviously enslaved Africans, are supposed to have arrived under the convoy of the Belisarius. That's the British warship escorting the convoy. The exact number I cannot yet ascertain. General Leslie's information, he's in South Carolina, to that head, to that number will no doubt be particular. They are disembarked with the loss of some small craft owing to their rashness in venturing over the bar without sufficient guides. So he mentions on Christmas Eve, actually the 23rd, he mentions that there's a number of shipwrecks. And then we have this letter was written on the 9th of January that says, I have the honor to inform your excellency that the fleet under convoy of the Belisarius with refugees and provisions arrived off this bar on the 31st of last month, so December 31st. But in coming over the bar, the Rattlesnake Galley and 2 provision vessels with 6 others, private property or private vessels, probably our ship, were lost. The 18-pounder, that's a cannon, and rigging of the galley were saved. 4 lives from the private vessels were lost. The cash arrived safe. So he told his boss, don't worry, we got the cash. The soldiers will not revolt because we can still pay them. And then we've just found so many artifacts as we continued to dig. In 2012, we found these muskets. So the buttons we found in 2012 as well. So by 2012, we're really figuring out what the heck we have going on. These 2 muskets were loaded. You can see in the x-ray. This one with buck and ball. So you have 1 musket ball and 3 buckshot. This one with lead pellets, like birdshot. So they were ready. And we know from the log of the Belisarius, that's the frigate that was escorting these vessels, a military escort. There were 5 examples where they wrote in the log that we saw strange sail. That means an unknown ship. And the sails usually fled the other way, but one of them tried to take over one of the merchant ships in the convoy. So they knew that was a privateer, clearly, rebel privateers. So they were ready. And the Belisarius sent a few rowboats full of soldiers, and they scared them off. So they were armed and ready. This was a wartime situation. In this concretion here, you can see there's a pistol, there's another gold coin, there's lead shot, there's some rigging elements like this iron hook here and this nail, and there's some kind of iron ring that's mostly rusted away. That's a close-up of that pistol. It looks pretty fancy. In fact, it's a pretty expensive pistol, so this probably would have been, I usually say this was either a gentleman's pistol or a scoundrel who murdered a gentleman and took his pistol. Once we cleaned it, you could actually see some writing on the side. This is an example from the internet. This is ours. So this is a little bit cleaner, but you can see London and then Ketland and Company. I think ours just says Ketland without company. So Thomas Ketland was a gunsmith. He actually worked in Birmingham, England, but he bought a warehouse or an office so that he could put London on his guns because they sold better in the colonies if they said London. And we actually have the proofing marks. So they tested the guns out. This is an example from an online specimen. This is our example, and then we've colored in the lettering here so you can see what they look like. But those show that the gun was tested in Birmingham and that it fired correctly. We found the parts from navigational instruments. This is from an octant, this eyepiece here. So this is, again, an online example, but you can see the little pinula here and here match what we found on the shipwreck site. We found, this was a really neat one, we found a sector rule. So maybe some of the folks in this room are old enough to remember slide rules. This was a precursor to the slide rule. I hope no one remembers the sector rule, but this was used to do mathematics, and it folded open and actually had a piece that slid out. And we were able to, in the lab, our conservators cleaned it so that they could actually fold it open again, which is pretty amazing. And there's writing on it, but we can't make it out. It might say London, that seems likely, but we can't quite tell for sure. Of course, many concretions, and when we x-ray them, we can see what's inside. In this case, we had a whole mass of nails. We have a hammer, and we have, what do you think this is? It looks like a little purse. It's a lock. Someone said lock. It's a padlock. Very good. It turns out the nails were in a leather pouch, and we couldn't see that in the x-ray. So this is phenomenal. This is from George Washington's time, a carpenter's pouch full of nails. This is a cobbler's hammer. So for repairing shoes, the yellow bits you see here, that's plastic resin that we have put in to to fill up holes that have rusted away. So that will stay there. And then when the iron is fully preserved, we can paint it and you'll never know that sections had rusted away. This is a lice comb. It's made of ivory, and now the lice comb's been cleaned. It looks beautiful. It looks like it's an ivory comb. If you have fourth graders in your life, you probably know how to use a lice comb. I know my family figured it out, but back in George Washington's time, everybody needed them, not just the kids. So it's much more common, especially on board a ship. Here's the oldest barbecue grill right here, cleaned up from the X-ray. These are copper pans, cooking pots. Some of the inside ones are in great shape. These outside ones have suffered a little more damage. This is an iron cauldron. 3 views of the same cauldron. This one we cleaned using an air scribe. So this little tool here is a very delicate pneumatic chisel, and that's how we clean off the concretion. And while the conservator was cleaning this, believe it or not, she found the remains of the last meal to have been prepared in that cooking pot. A single green pea, split in half here, and the little skin was with it as well. And it's much smaller than we think of a pea. It's more like a lentil size, but that's a good old-fashioned British pea, peas and porridge right there. So it's amazing what can be preserved on these shipwrecks. We have, again, they're British, so they drink their tea. A tea kettle is very important. Clothing irons. And if I had to evacuate my home, I would not worry about bringing the irons along, but we found like about a dozen irons. So this was an important piece of household equipment for these people. And we know that the governor had been ordered by the king to give land away to loyalists who were forced to flee their homes to reward them for their loyalty. And so you would certainly want to look your best when you went and petition the governor. So father would need to have his clothes ironed and looking as good as possible, even if they were living in a tent, a refugee tent, so that he could go petition the governor and get the best piece of land possible. Furniture, hardware, shoe buckles, door locks. This was an interesting one. This is the X-ray. This is the bronze door lock itself. So this would be on the outside of your door. It's pretty big compared to what we think of today. And you'd have a big key that would open that up. Well, people, when we looked on the inside of this, the key, you can't see it here, we've removed it, but the key was still inside. And then the whole thing was wrapped up in this burlap. And there's actually scraps of that cloth remaining. So someone took the door lock off their home, put the key inside it for safekeeping, wrapped it up, and brought it with them, and then they lost it. So we know that people were bringing whatever hardware they could because St. Augustine was being flooded with refugees. So you couldn't go pick up a door lock at the hardware store. There was no telling when you could get something like that. So you'd bring it with you if you could. Yeah, there's the key. You can see it there. And again, it's yellow because the key was iron and it rusted away. But the mold was there in the concretion, so we have a perfect cast, a replica of that key. And we even have a fake watch. We could see in the X-ray there was some kind of numbering or lettering going in a circle. We open it up and we have hands to a watch, and we have Roman numerals 1 through 12. And then we realize, well, the hands are cast into the pewter, so there's no way they could move. So what the heck's going on? And after doing more research, we realized this is a fake watch. So this is the knockoff Rolex of George Washington's time. Believe it or not. I mean, you have such amazing insight into what life was like for these people from a well-preserved shipwreck like this. So, in conclusion, this shipwreck in particular was a really exciting one to work on. This is one that it had a lot of meaning for me. My family and I became refugees when our house was flooded in Hurricane Matthew. So I all of a sudden had a lot of insight into what it would be like having to leave your home and take the essentials with you and try to keep your kids feeling like life was going to be normal and everything was going to be okay. And so to see that in the archaeological record was really a privilege. I mean, it's a really unique insight. I think that archaeologists can look into something like that and try to get in the mindset of refugees from a war-torn country from centuries ago. And so this was a story that had a lot of personal meaning for me, and and really was very fulfilling as an archaeologist to work on a shipwreck like this. So I'll leave you with this quote from a loyalist in London. November in London, dark, damp, heavy. No wonder people hang themselves in winter. I spend my days as in a dream, thinking of the little cottage I left behind. We are aliens here. What I would give right now for a Carolina peach. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And today, I think we learned the difference between historic archaeology and prehistoric archaeology. You have this wonderful detective story that you can invest yourself in to find out what was the detail of this story. How many, I take it all the passengers survived?
Probably most survived. So remember, we had the one account that said there were a few, I think they said 4 lives were lost. Oh, wait. Here, I put it away too soon. So we think there was actually not a very heavy loss of life. So remember, this ship wrecked because it ran aground. So what happened is this ship ran hard onto the sandbar, and it would have certainly lurched, and it would have thrown people off their feet, and you would have had wooden pulleys and spars and rigging fall from overhead. So you might have got clonked on the head. You might have been thrown down a hatch. You might have been thrown overboard. So there would have been injuries, and there may have been some loss of life. And remember, we had the military commander's letter that I think said that there were 4 lives lost from the private vessels. But certainly most of these people survived. They were just in quite a predicament. They were destitute because all of their possessions were beyond their access below the hold. And at some point, probably quickly thereafter, the ship came to pieces.
Questions? Yeah, online, yeah.
I have one comment and one question, and my comment is I was impressed with the quality of the penmanship on those papers that you showed. It's very legible. And then my question is, was there any interest in the plankton in the water around the wrecks? It looks so murky. I was curious to know what could have been in there.
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I will say, probably part of the reason that I displayed those documents, actually they were key documents, but the handwriting was particularly good on those. Some of them are really difficult to read. And it was typical in the time period, you would have clerks, or a lot of clerks employed by the Royal Navy, and you know, officers had their own secretaries. And so you would write a letter out, and then, and actually you probably wouldn't write it out. You might write it out on your own, and then you'd give it to your clerk, or else you would dictate it to your clerk, and the clerk would make copies, because you want to send multiple copies in different ships, because it's just so dangerous for ships sailing out there during a war. You had a better chance of it getting to where it was supposed to go. So often I found some of those letters I found multiple copies of, and so I picked the ones that had the best handwriting. Some of them were really difficult to read. Some of them were quite legible, as you pointed out. So I don't know why you think if you were a clerk, you know, you think you'd be the best clerk if you had good handwriting, but it could be pretty difficult to see. As far as testing the water, we didn't do any kind of plankton study. I mean, you know, none of us are biologists, so we probably didn't even think of that. That's one of the that's a good reason for multidisciplinary studies. You know, if it would have been a good thing if we had had some biologists diving with us. They probably would have had some ideas like that that didn't even occur to us. The sediment samples that we took and sifted, we didn't do that for years. We didn't realize that was a viable way of collecting data until we saw examples on other shipwreck sites. And then we did that the very last year, and we found insect remains, and it was killing me. Like, if we'd been doing this the previous 4 years in a row, we would have so much more stuff. So in hindsight, you always, you know, now I'm curious what we might find. And the water, it was quite it was always different. We often had surge, and that stirred up the bottom. Some days we were lucky there might be a strong enough current to kind of carry some of that stuff away, and that's when we tended to have better visibility, but it was often poor. So it'd certainly be of interest to learn more about the oceanography of it, but we didn't actually do any plankton studies. Sure. Oh, why was the ship piece buried on the beach left there? Is it because LAMP has no place to preserve it? That's a good question. And that's part of the answer is if you were to recover that, you would certainly need to find, you'd have to have the space. And that's a big piece, right? That's 25 feet by 16 feet or something like that. But even more importantly is the money to preserve it. So if you bring up, so that wood has been waterlogged, which means you can't just dry it out. It'll start to crumble and crack to pieces. And that was a problem we had with the spring break wreck, the one that just came ashore. That one, we just recorded it as quickly as we could. And after a few days, you could no longer see the Roman numerals. And a few days after that, you couldn't see any of the tool marks. And it just was crumbling before our eyes. And we couldn't easily put it back in the water. It was, if we had been able to tow it out to sea and sink it and bury it, but that's a pretty big operation to do. But that's the only, we could have tried to dig a big hole in the beach and bury it, but you'd have to get environmental permits to do that. So in that case, there wasn't very much we could do. With the Crescent Beach wreck, we dug down to it, we recorded it, and the sand is very wet down there, so it's staying wet. So if we just bury it again, as long as it doesn't get unburied and impacted by storms, it'll last pretty much forever. We have wooden hull remains from Bronze Age shipwrecks in the Mediterranean that if they stay buried, that wood will stay preserved for 2,000 years. So it would cost over $1 million to preserve just, the chemicals and the time of the conservators to preserve a piece of wood that big. And then you still have to have a place to put it on display or to store it. And we only have limited space in our museum.
So, well, any other questions? John?
One brief question about, hi,
Hi.
great talk. One brief question about the National Geographic photos. How did they do that? What was that technique?
Well, it's basically just digital graphics, right? It's just like you get, it's CGI. And the great thing about National Geographic, I will say, is that they clearly valued the authenticity of what they were doing. So they were in very regular contact with me and asking me questions, and they would send me screenshots and say, is this what this would look like? So for example, they had pictures of the ships wrecked with their anchors out, and they sent a close-up of the anchor rope, and they said, is this what a ship's anchor rope would look like? And I looked at them like, well, actually, no, not at all. It doesn't look anything like this. And then I would send them photographs from an archaeological dig that had preserved anchor rope, and lo and behold, they would change it and make it look realistic. So they were very sincere in wanting to get it just right. And so I felt very lucky as an archaeologist to work with a group that took that work so seriously, because a lot of times you work with folks to make a documentary and there's all kinds of inaccuracies, or a news story. They often have inaccuracies if they won't let you review it before they publish it. So I was really impressed, not only with their graphics team, but the fact that they were trying to do such good quality control with their graphics.
Great, thanks.
Sure thing.
Okay, well, thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And we're all the wiser. We're all the wiser for it.
Well, it's a lot of fun sharing this, and what a great group. It's so nice meeting all of you. Thank you.